Welcome to my sixth lecture on Middle East politics. For today's lecture, we're going to talk about the emergence of modernization in the Middle East. Now, in the previous unit, the last five lectures, I laid the groundwork for understanding the region by talking about the traditional Islamic world, the time before modernity. So we talked a lot about Islam, what makes a Muslim, the five pillars. We also talked a lot about the differences between Sunni and Shia. We also discussed Islam's historical relationship with other faiths like Christianity and Judaism. We also discussed the rise and fall of the Golden Age of Islam and the Abbasid Caliphate. And finally, we discussed the rise of the gunpowder empires and the Turkish invasions of the region and what impact that had on the politics of the Middle East. So all of these events are critical for understanding how modernity is going to impact the Middle East, right? We can't understand the impacts of modernization without understanding what came before. So if you haven't watched those lectures, I recommend doing so. Now, for today's lecture, we're going to talk about what modernization is and how it impacted the region. So I'm going to share my screen with all of you. Okay, so here it is. So in order to understand this lecture, we really first have to discuss what is this concept modernity and modernization. It's a controversial term. It comes with a lot of baggage. So we want to make sure what this concept is and different perspectives on it. So I'm going to do that first. And in the process, we're also going to discuss as well why modernization began in Europe. Why did it begin in this part of the world? And this might have surprised a time traveler. If you go back 1,000 years from now, the Middle East and the Islamic world were the most powerful civilization. But if you go then to the 18th, 19th century, suddenly Europe had taken the mantle as the world's most powerful civilization. So we're going to understand why this happened, why the Europeans became so powerful. And finally, we're going to understand why it is that modernization in Europe also caused the decline of those gunpowder empires we talked about in the last lecture, the Ottoman and Safavid empires. So before getting to this, I highly recommend watching this video clip really quickly. It goes over the women's rights movement in Iran. And if you watch this video, one of the things you'll notice is that the world we live in today and the world the Middle East currently occupies is very different from what existed 1,000 years ago. Many new values have entered the region. In fact, when you watch this video, you'll notice that there are a lot of modern, dynamics to today's politics in the region. For one, in the country of Iran, there is a women's rights movement, and this movement promotes feminism, equality between men and women. This contradicts the traditional ideals of Sharia, which are patriarchal, in which men have dominance, right? Men can marry up to 4 wives. Women can't do that. Men can more easily get divorced than women. Men, for example, get twice the amount of inheritance as women. There's also other things about this video that you might notice are modern in nature, right? These protests in Iran are taking place in cities. The Middle East has urbanized greatly in the last couple of centuries. And on top of that as well, you might also notice some of the rhetoric some of these female activists are using. They're using rhetoric such as equality, democracy. They're engaging in modern social movement tactics like protests. And even the modern Iranian state, right? It's got access to a lot of modern technology to be able to suppress those protests. So there's a lot of this that screams modern. Now, at the same time, though, there's a lot of this that also screams traditional. Right. So for one, there are many in Iran that oppose this feminist movement. There are many conservatives that really support the traditional application of Sharia law, Islamic law. Right now, Iran currently lives under a dictatorship, right? So it's an authoritarian political system. So what you could say about modernity and its impacts on the world and specifically the Middle East is that it's caused a lot of conflict as well as developments. It's led to a lot of clashes between traditional and modern values, and we have seen this impartial transition politically, economically, and culturally to the modern world. So, what exactly is modernization? And how has it impacted the region? So let's start first with this term economic modernization. There are three major types of modernization: economic, political, and cultural. We'll go over them one at a time. So with economic, we're referring to this transition from an agricultural to an industrial based economy. You went back 1,000 years ago to the Middle East or Europe, the vast majority of people lived in the countryside. They worked either as farmers or as pastoralists, herding animals. They lived in small villages. They were mostly illiterate. And communication was slow. Life expectancies were short, and people were deeply religious. And of course, these societies, these peasant societies, for the most part, were not politically conscious. They didn't have much in the way of political power. They lived in these kind of authoritarian regimes. Now, flash forward to the present day, and now the world, particularly over the last 2 centuries, has really begun to industrialize greatly. Many people have moved to cities. In the process, they have begun to work in industries mass producing goods in factories. And this would not be possible without the emergence of modern science and modern technology. This has led to great changes in the way people live their lives. We have seen this shift from rural areas to urban areas, people living in densely packed cities, having higher life expectancies, and having really a greater standard of living than in the past. Although, as I'm going to talk about, this process has been uneven throughout the world. Some parts of the world have urbanized more than others. And even for many who have moved to cities, the conditions of different cities in the world have differed greatly, even within the Middle East. So there's a difference between living in a nice middle or upper class neighborhood and living in a shanty town, for example. So we have seen these great transitions throughout the world, and this has took place in the Middle East as well. And we've also seen as well great changes in the nature of labor. If you remember from previous lectures, we talked about how slavery was something that existed in the Islamic world as well as in the pre-modern world in Europe and in the United States. In the Islamic world, they had different forms of slavery, such as slavery on farms. They had domestic slavery. They used female sex concubines in very wealthy homes. So we talked about the harem last time in the Ottoman and Safavid empires. And they used slaves as soldiers, right? So we talked about the Janissary, for example, in the Ottoman Empire. But by the time we transition to the modern world, we're going to start to see the abolition of slavery, and slaves are going to be freed, and we're going to see this movement to more free labor, the free movement of labor. Although, of course, labor exploitation still does exist out there in the world. So let's interpret these images here. And so let's look at this image to the right here. This is an example of traditional agriculture. And how can you tell? Well, we're seeing animals, right, that are powering agriculture as well as physical labor. So agriculture, for it to be modern, has to be mechanized. Tractors, for example, right? Modern machinery. But in this image, we're seeing traditional agricultural methods. This is a photo that was taken a little over 100 years ago in Egypt, and you can tell what's in the background there. It's the pyramids of Giza, right? And we've got the Nile River right behind it. And of course, the image to the left also represents a traditional lifestyle. We're seeing these pastoral nomads, but it's more of a more recent image. There's still some pockets in the Middle East and North Africa where we do still find traditional methods, particularly in the deserts of the Sahara and the oases. So these methods have not disappeared completely, but they are starting to disappear overall. Life has changed greatly. Now, if any of you have ever seen Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, If you remember those images from Cairo that they showed, that movie was supposed to take place during World War II. They showed these so-called images from Cairo as if it was this backwater, if it was as if it was this kind of rural village. But the reality is that the real Cairo of that time was actually heavily urbanized. And if you look at the image of the left, this is Cairo in the present day. So Cairo is heavily urbanized. It is densely packed and crowded. And you can look at this and see many examples of modernity here, right? We have factories in the background. We've got a lot of pollution. So not all aspects of modernization are good. And we have a lot of wealth gaps between rich and poor. In the front of this image, we find a lot of shanty towns, people living in poorer parts of the city. Although notice that even these poor people have access to satellite dishes, right? So modern means of communication and entertainment. And this image to the right shows an even wealthier city in Dubai, a very, very oil-rich country. The United Arab Emirates has very wealthy cities, wealthy people living within them. And so notice the modern infrastructure and the automobiles and the highway systems here, right? So there has been a transformation in the Middle East in the last 2 centuries, right? It's changing this part of the world. And it's not just economics that's changing, it's also politics. Politics is modernizing. And so what do we mean by political modernization? It means we're moving from what's called a non-hegemonic state to a hegemonic state. Now, don't get this term state confused with how Americans use the term state, like it's 50 provinces. By state, I mean a set of institutions that controls a territory, or what you better know as a government, okay? Now, a non-hegemonic state is a pre-modern state, a state that struggles to control all of its territory and doesn't have fixed borders. So pre-modern empires, lacked modern technology and modern communications and modern weapons. They couldn't control the countries in full that they ruled over. But a hegemonic state dominates all of its territory and has fixed borders, right? And there are a couple of things that make a modern state hegemonic in nature. Number one, you need a modern military and police force, tanks, aircrafts, automatic weapons, right? These things give a military a lot of power. And of course, modern militaries have modern ways to train their officers, professional academic institutions, as do police forces through police academies. Modern states as well are very efficient in terms of their bureaucracies. They're very good at collecting taxes. So think about it this way. When you pay your taxes today, you could go online if you're an American citizen and pay your taxes through the IRS's online website, for example. And so tax collection is much more efficient and it's direct. The state is taxing people directly. Whereas with non-hegemonic states, it was often the case that monarchies and emperors wouldn't collect taxes from the peasantry directly. Instead, they would often collect those taxes from an intermediary, such as a local noble, a local aristocrat. So those aristocrats would often have a lot of autonomous power over their local region. So think of like a feudal state, for example, the local landlord in their castle. So tax collection in the hegemonic state is much more efficient and direct. And of course, part of what enables bureaucracies to be more efficient, as well as militaries, is having a modern infrastructure. For example, if you have modern highways and cars and railways, it's easier for the military and the police and bureaucrats to get from point A to point B. It's easy to travel. Furthermore, modern telecommunications enables you to communicate much more quickly from one place to another. And modern ports, of course, allow for being able to send ships, right, from one destination to another relatively quickly. And finally, aircraft, for example, allows for quick transportation. And finally, creating a modern state and controlling people, it's not just about having a strong military to suppress dissent or to protect your borders or having a modern infrastructure. It's also about as well shaping the minds of citizens. It's much easier for states to control people if they want to be ruled by the state. So having a public education system that promotes national identity, a strong sense of national identity, in the sense that all citizens are represented by the states, This makes it easier for the state to control people. And so think about this from an American citizen. Where did you learn to be an American citizen? For many people, they learned it in their public schools, right? Doing the Pledge of Allegiance every single day creates a sense of national identity, a sense of loyalty to the government. And so by doing this, the modern nation state, right, creates a sense of identity, a sense of loyalty. It's easier for them to mass recruit troops and to get people to serve in the bureaucracy. Now, part of having a modern state as well is also having this transition from a monarchy to a democracy. Now, in the pre-modern world in the Middle East, as well as in pre-modern Europe, political systems were dominated by monarchies. We talked about in previous lectures, for example, the Caliphate, for example, the Abbasid Caliphate and the Umayyad Caliphate, they were both monarchies, right? So power was passed down from father to son, and power was concentrated in the hands of the monarch in that small inner circle, right, of their loyal allies, that aristocracy and the military. But democracies are different, right? Democracies share power amongst a much larger number of individuals. Ideally, all adult citizens should have the right to vote and have representation in government. And so this transition from the modern world involves a transition from a monarchy to a democracy. And arguably, democracies are stronger politically because they command the loyalty of a greater number of citizens. Think about it from this standpoint. If you feel like you're being represented by your government, you're more likely to be loyal to the states. So let's look at these two slides here just to compare traditional with modern in the Middle East. So this slide to the left has some signs, right, of tradition. This is an image from the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. And what do we see here? We see soldiers marching on foot. We don't see modern tanks, modern automobiles, modern aircraft, right? Soldiers had to pretty much march or ride on horseback from one point to another, or use ships sailing. And we also see here as well, to the right, the Ottoman Sultan, the image of the Ottoman Sultan, right? The singularity of the Sultan's rule, the absolute monarchy, power vested in the monarch itself, and these kind of traditional hierarchical values. Now, of course, not all aspects of the Middle East prior to the coming of Europe and modernization were completely traditional. They were developments before the coming of the Europeans that did introduce a few modern developments. One example of this is being gunpowder, for example. We talked about how part of what made the Ottoman and Safavid empires powerful was the introduction of guns. And we can see here that these individuals are carrying rifles, although it's important to keep in mind these were not automatic weapons. You had to fire one shot at a time, reload the cartridge, reload the bullet, and then fire again. So not quite as efficient as today's weapons. And they didn't have factories to mass produce these weapons. Another important point to keep in mind here. Now, in contrast, states in the Middle East look far more modern today. This is the Egyptian military today. The Egyptian military has tanks and automatic weapons and aircraft, right? Their military is modern in nature. In fact, a lot of these weapons are bought from the United States. We give Egypt about $2 billion a year in aid. On top of that as well, Egyptian politics looks very different from the Ottoman Sultanate. This image here is an image of Egypt's parliament, known in Arabic as the Mejlis. And notice here we have a lot of elected officials sitting in parliament discussing legislation. In fact, Egypt calls itself a republic today. It has a legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Sound familiar? This is kind of like the United States. Now, here's the thing, though. This transition to modernity has been very imperfect for Egypt. While it has these type of institutions, elections, unfortunately, are pretty much rigged. Their president, their last election was elected with about 99% of the vote. General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi is president, but he is for the most part a dictator. And because all of the political parties are loyal to Sisi, there's no real competition in the elections for the legislature. In fact, parties that too strongly oppose the dictatorship are either not allowed to run or they're only allowed to get a few seats in the legislature. And on top of that, Sisi has appointed all the judges. So there's no real separation of powers. But even with this, keeping this in mind, the very fact that Egyptian political leaders feel the need to put on this farce of having a legislature and having a president and a quote unquote independent judiciary says something about the political culture of the Middle East today. We have seen democratic values become more and more important in recent history. In fact, Egypt recently had a revolution. While that revolution did not successfully lead to democratization in 2011, it did signal that there are many Egyptians who support democracy out there. And of course, those protests from hopefully that video you watched from Iran are another example of how modern values are impacting this region. One last aspect of modernization that is important, cultural modernization. So cultural modernization deals with what are called changes in values. Values are one's judgment for what is best for society. Now, in traditional cultures, they tend to value hierarchy. That is this idea that not all people are equal to each other. Fathers should have more power than mothers. Sons should have more power than daughters. Kings should have more power than peasants. Religious elites should have more power than people who live in slavery, for example. So these systems tend to promote hierarchy. And there are lots of examples of hierarchy that we talked about in the previous lectures. Slavery, for example, the existence of inequality within Sharia law towards women, inequality towards Christians and Jews, right? We talked about the people of the book and they had to pay a special tax, for example. So lots of hierarchy within those systems. But in today's world, right, we're starting to see a greater emphasis on equality, including within the Middle East. We're seeing the spread, for example, of feminist movements and pro-democracy movements, and they're starting to clash with these traditional values. And there's also other changes as well. The pre-modern world tends to emphasize theocracy, a strong belief in God, and the mixing of religion and politics. We talk, for example, of how under the Abbasid caliphs and under the Turkish sultans and under the Safavid sultanates, the strong emphasis on enforcing Sharia law. Religious values shaped law codes in the pre-Islamic world. And there was a strong belief in Islam as well as other monotheistic faiths like Christianity and Judaism. But in the modern world, what is starting to change, we're seeing the emergence of secularism. That is people who want to separate church and states. So in that video you watched from Iran, there are many feminist protesters, right, that are calling for the separation of church and states. Many women that want to take off the hijabs and start to participate in politics as equals with men. And this involves having to separate religion from state. This is something that's been a struggle in the Middle East in the last 2 centuries. And connected to that is a shift from patriarchy to feminism, a shift from male dominance of politics and social systems to one in which women are demanding a greater say in governments. And finally, we're also seeing this shift from what we call fatalism to progress. Now, fatalism is this idea that we don't really have control over our lives. Our lives are short. It's a struggle. We're going to die at any given moment. And, the world's not going to change much in our lifetimes. So we might as well not try to change this world, but focus on the next life, right? Pray, do your 5 pillars. Pray 5 times a day. Believe in one God and that Muhammad is his last prophet. Make that pilgrimage to Mecca. Make sure to fast during Ramadan and hopefully God will reward you in the next life. And of course, for Christians, right, go to church on Sunday, believe in God and that Jesus is the Son of God. You do these things, God will reward you. In contrast, in the modern world, we are starting to see this notion of progress, right, become more and more prominent. This idea that we don't have to wait until we die to do good things for the world, right? We can make changes, investing in science and education. We can make cultural changes to the world. And so let's look at some of these images here just to highlight this. To the left, we can see how this is an example of traditional religious values and norms. Okay, we see here women wearing the hijab and praying, and they are being separated, see this image to the right, from men. They cannot pray in the same places. And in fact, only an imam during prayer can be a male. And of course, the mosque itself is an example of a traditional religious institution, right? We're focusing on God, we're focusing on the next life. In contrast, we see here these images from the modern world, modern values. So this image on the left here represents, okay, a group of protesters, okay, a mix of men and women. This was during the Arab Spring in 2011 in Egypt that were protesting for democracy. And some of these protesters are quite liberal, many of them women's rights activists. Notice many of the women are not wearing an hijab, for example. So many of them are secular, okay? And this image to the right, okay, this comes from the school where I taught for about 8 years, the modern education schools in New Cairo. And notice that word modern in the name of the school. And all of these kids here, notice we have boys and girls going to school together. And they're waving the Egyptian flag, a sign of modern nationalism, right? Nationalistic values. And we also, at this school where I taught, they learned about the modern sciences. They learned about mathematics. They learned about things like history, right? They were into social sciences. So it's modernity, right? Promoting modern values. And of course, these kids were hoping to get a good education, get a good job after they graduate. Some were even hoping to go abroad to Europe and the United States. So, and of course, these values, these modern values, they don't exist in isolation of traditional values. Okay, traditional values still exist throughout the Middle East. And in fact, many individuals hold some values that are traditional and others that are modern. There are some people, for example, that believe in women's equality, but not LGBTQ equality. There are some people that believe in democracy, but not in women's rights. So there's oftentimes you see this kind of mix as well as this clash of different values, as exemplified by that video you watched. Now, when did modernization begin and why? Well, it began in Western Europe for the most part, okay? And it's a process in many ways that's still taking place in Europe and elsewhere. We're still seeing clashes over it. This is something that's important to keep in mind. Now, there's a couple of reasons why this took place. About 1,000 years ago, when climates were getting worse in the Middle East due to desertification, lands were being lost to the expanding desert in the Sahara and the Arabian Peninsula, the climate was actually improving in Europe. Those same warmer climates were actually making it better for agriculture within medieval Europe. And as the climate improved, so did agriculture improved. Food production began to increase. And with that, the size of cities, right? As you're producing more food, that leaves more surplus for merchants, for people living in cities, right? So the size of cities starts to grow. Trade starts to improve. Suddenly, kings have more tax wealth to collect from the countryside, and the infrastructure improves. Roads starts to improve, and this leads to what's called the commercial revolution in Europe, which took place from the 14th to the 15th century. And as cities begin to grow, we begin to see the growth of this urban middle class of merchants, artisans, and the growth as well of universities and schools, and literacy begins to grow. This period in Europe's history is known as the Renaissance, the rebirth of European culture after 1,000 years of decline following the end of the Roman Empire. And during this time as well, they begin to translate documents from Arabic into Latin and other languages. So all those documents that were preserved during the Golden Age of Islam from Greece and Persia, right, they then got translated in Europe in places like Spain and Italy. And so through the Renaissance, we get the rebirth of European culture and literacy. And with that as well, we also begin to see a growth in long distance trade. Merchants begin trading longer distances. They begin to establish banks and currency to make it easier to trade across long distances. We also see the emergence of joint stock companies, what we now know as corporations. And because of this long distance trade, they begin to invest in a lot of developments in new shipping technologies, such as the caravel. And suddenly, Europeans began exploring beyond Europe. They began sending ships through the Mediterranean, into the Atlantic Ocean, around the African continent, and eventually to the Americas. And in the Americas, Europeans begin to settle, form colonies. Much of the indigenous population was wiped out by mass violence and disease. And from that, they begin to establish plantations and mines. They begin to bring over slaves from West Africa to the Americas to work in these mines and on these plantations. First, it was the Spanish and Portuguese, and then later the British, the French, and the Dutch began to settle in the New World. And from this, the Europeans grew even wealthier. They brought a lot of that wealth, a lot of the gold and silver that they mined in the New World, as well as a lot of cash crops like cotton, like sugar and tobacco. They bring it back to Europe. And because of all these economic developments, and because these cities were growing wealthier, and as the middle class grew, suddenly a more educated population began to emerge. And this educated population began to question the superstitious teachings of the Catholic Church. Many religious folks also began to question the dominance of the Catholic Church and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. Many people wanted the ability to interpret the Bible on their own as individuals and not rely on traditional institutions like Catholicism to tell them how to interpret the Bible. They also wanted to translate the Bible from Latin into other languages so they could read it themselves. So they wanted to get rid of this archaic language, Latin, from the days of the Roman Empire and translate the book into German and English. And in the early 16th century, a reformer named Martin Luther, he takes these reforms that he wanted the Catholic Church to make, he posts it on the door of his church, and this sparks a mass revolution throughout Europe, aided by the printing press, which began to spread word of Martin Luther's teachings to the rest of the continent. And thus, we get the Protestant Reformation, this mass revolution against the Catholic Church. And as a consequence, the Catholic Church loses its influence over the politics of the continent. We start to see the emergence of a secular and literate political culture in Europe, one where there was more freedom to question the church and to promote new sciences. So with the Catholic Church declining, suddenly Europeans are freer to question the world. So at a time when Salafism was really starting to dominate the Middle East and the golden age of Islam was declining, right? There was this kind of stagnation in culture. Europe was growing and becoming more innovative. And thus, we get this age called the Enlightenment. Suddenly, Europeans are not just copying the Roman past, the Greek past, or translating documents from the Arab world. They're adding their own innovations. During the Enlightenment, many people began to not only question the church, but the power of monarchs. And they began to push for the spread of democracy and meritocracy. They began to push for power by the people, right? To have voting, the ability to question the political systems they lived under, as well as to be treated as equals, right? Not be treated as subjects by monarchs. So they began to promote equality. And they also as well began to promote intellectual endeavors such as science, right? They began to promote the scientific method. And the scientific method, it led to the emergence of modern engineering, calculus, okay? And this in turn enabled the growth of what we call mass production, the emergence of factories, right, that can mass produce goods. So by the late 18th century in England, we see the emergence of the first factories that can mass produce first clothing and later guns, okay? And so thus, we get mass production of goods. The economies of Europe begin to grow rapidly. And with that, the power of modern states, right? This leads to the growth of powerful nation states, those hegemonic states I talked about earlier. Now, because of this power that the Europeans had suddenly, not only were the states in Europe growing more powerful, but they could expand that power out to the rest of the world. They were able suddenly to conquer different regions. First, the Americas, and later Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, right? Creating these massive empires out there. And let me just show you just some key evidence to display this. So this is looking at what's called gross domestic product growth over the last 2 centuries. Now, by the late 18th century, Europe began to industrialize. And from there, they really raced ahead of the rest of the world. So we're looking at GDP growth in the West here, Western Europe, and it's some of its first colonies like the United States, Canada, and Australia. And then notice how the rest of the world fell behind. And they only started to catch up more recently, and they're still behind to this day. And let's also take some other examples here of this dominance. The first colonies the Europeans had were in the Americas. Okay, and when they colonized the Americas here, they ended up extracting a lot of mineral resources and cash crops with the use of slaves from West Africa. This is known as the triangular trade, and they brought it back to Europe. And this had several critical effects on world politics. For one, of course, the civilizations of the Americas were destroyed. But number two, by establishing these coastal cities on the African coast and trading and raiding for slaves, it ended up really hurting the Muslims' control of long-distance trade routes throughout the globe. For example, one of those trade routes, as you learned in a previous lecture, was across the Saharan deserts. Well, because Europeans began to establish these trade routes overseas, they cut out the middleman. It used to be that if the Europeans wanted to get access to goods from the Sahara and sub-Saharan Africa, such as slaves, for example, they had to trade through the Muslim world. They had to get those things from Muslim merchants. But now they could cut off the Muslim middleman. And so this seriously hurt the profits of these Muslim middlemen. Now, it's not only their trans-Saharan trade that got cut off. It was also that Silk Road trade. It used to be that the Muslims controlled the trade routes that connected China with Europe. But because of the fact that Europeans were eventually able to sail around the African continent and establish colonies in places like India, suddenly the Europeans didn't need those Muslim middlemen to trade with places like India and China and get those spices they desired. And so what ended up happening is that we see this great weakening of the Middle East and other Asian empires, right? Trade declines, the amount of wealth they could have declines. And by the 19th century, once Europeans industrialized, they had a great advantage over these Asian empires, even though the Ottoman Empire did have gunpowder. And so what eventually happens, as you can see on this map, is eventually all of the Middle East is going to be, or just about all of it, is going to be colonized in one way or another, or at least very heavily influenced by these European powers. The countries in green are those that at one point were colonized by Europe. And as you can see, Europe here is in purple. This means that just about the whole globe experienced this, right? So this is evidence of the domination of Europe. And this is what I mean by modernization. I don't mean to say by this that there were no important developments in Middle East history or the history of other regions of the world before the coming of modern Europe. Of course there were, right? We talked about in a previous lecture how algebra, for example, developed during the golden age of Islam, right? The Middle East is the center of some of the world's first civilizations, but it is difficult to deny that something dramatic happened here between the 15th and the 19th centuries that transformed global politics. This is what modernity is, this great transformation. And of course, it had a dramatic impact on the Middle East empires, the Ottoman and Safavid empires. For the Ottoman Empire specifically, it witnessed this loss of revenue from long-distance trade, right? And less wealth, right, means less in taxes the Ottoman Empire can collect. But worse still, because you had a lot of this silver and gold flowing back from the new world, flowing from the new world back to the old world, right? When you add more gold and silver to an economy, right, this leads to inflation. The worth of the gold and silver, okay, declines. And suddenly, goods become more expensive throughout Eurasia. It becomes more difficult for the Ottoman Empire to be able to pay their soldiers and bureaucrats. The influx of gold and silver from the Americas had a severely negative effect on China India, and the Ottoman Safavid empires, the gunpowder empires. And so what does this do? It leads to the economic decline of the empire, right? And this means that there is less wealth to tax from trade, and thus the Ottoman Empire had to start taxing the peasantry more heavily. And so taxes go up on the peasantry, and this leads to lots of peasant revolts, all sorts of problems. On top of this, the Ottoman Empire had to start lowering their salaries for civil servants, even as inflation was taking place. And you guys know how bad inflation is, right? So right now, it's quite a problem for the United States, and it was a big problem during this time in Ottoman history. Now, as these bureaucrats start to receive lower and lower salaries, well, this incentivizes corruption, right? So if I'm not making much as a bureaucrat, I'm going to start to take more bribes in exchange for giving out services. So I might, for example, as a tax collector, say, I'll look the other way on collecting the taxes, but just give me a little something, right, on the side. In fact, the Arabs today jokingly call this shay or tea. And I is shay. I want some tea. Pay up. So this leads this era to growing corruption in the Ottoman bureaucracy, which means they have greater challenges with enforcing laws and collecting taxes, right? We see this loss of discipline in the Ottoman bureaucracy and armed forces, a discipline that used to be there at the beginnings of the Ottoman Empire when it conquered this huge chunk of the Middle East. And so what happens as a consequence of this is the Ottoman government starts to lose the ability to control the provinces. The local elites, the governors, which the Ottomans knew as beys, they began to claim autonomy and to be able to gain control of their local lands while still nominally being part of the Ottoman Empire, only in name. So the Ottoman government slowly loses its control over the provinces. And specifically, Algeria, Tunisia, Tripoli, that's what is known as Libya today. Tripoli is the capital of Libya, and Egypt. They gradually gained autonomy from the Ottoman Empire. And we also see as well the emergence of secessionist movements in civil wars, particularly in this region called the Balkans. That's where Greece, Serbia, Albania are located today. And we see this heavily Christian region, then ruled by the Ottoman Empire, they begin to rebel against Ottoman rule extensively. And so what also happens over time is, so not only is the cohesion of the empire starting to break apart, but as it becomes weaker in relation to the Europeans then are going to start to take lands one at a time from the Ottoman Empire. The Russians, the British, the French, they are going to eat into the Ottoman Empire. Okay, first with Algeria in 1830 in North Africa, and then over time, more and more territory is going to be taken. And eventually, the entire empire is going to collapse by 1918. And we're going to talk more about these developments in the next couple of lectures, but now know what's going to eventually happen to this empire. It's going to collapse. And in the process of this, as the Ottomans began to watch their empire collapse, a new generation of reformers are going to emerge to try to save it before it fully collapses. Okay, and so modernization is going to eventually take in, whether it's under European rule or prior to European rule, as people try to reform this empire. And so here's just a map showing the decline of the Ottoman Empire. So this is, the first territory in North Africa that got lost is 1830. And in terms of Greece, they had a secessionist movement. They became independent in 1829. And so over time, the Ottomans just started to lose one territory at a time, okay? And this is all that was left of the Ottoman Empire on the eve of World War I in 1914. And just 4 years later, the rest of it would collapse. Now, just one last thing here. It's not just the Ottoman Empire that would eventually collapse. It was the Safavid Empire. Remember the Safavid Empire was that Twelver Shia empire based in Iran. And it, just like the Ottoman Empire, it declined economically for the same exact reasons. Its decline started greatly in the 18th century. It lost access to its trade routes. It had to increase taxes on the peasantry. It saw a lot of peasant revolts and a lot of internal discontent. And on top of that as well, the British and Russians began to really eat into their trade routes and even start to take control of territory. It caused similar problems just like the Ottoman Empire. And this loss of tax revenue, okay, as they begin to lose tax revenue over time, this weakened the Safavid dynasty, this monarchy. And we begin to see these internal rebellions, okay, as they lose control of the provinces. And the empire itself, it didn't even last as long as the Ottomans. In fact, it collapsed in 1732 when a tribal confederation from Afghanistan invaded. At that point, the Safavids were a shell of their former self. The empire collapses. In the ensuing 50 years, there was a long civil war in Iran. And so it really collapsed into oblivion. And so what was once this really prolific empire is no more. It would eventually rebound, this region, Iran, about 50 years later. The winner of this civil war was a tribal confederation called the Qajars, led by Muhammad Khan. In 1797, he's going to bring a return to monarchy and to centralization of Iran. But they're going to experience the same type of problems that the Safavid dynasty is going to experience. They're going to have to try to reform, to save the empire, and eventually they're going to fail by the early 20th century. And eventually the empire is going to collapse completely by 1925. So just like the Ottomans, they are going to as well collapse. And in the process, a new generation of reformers is going to emerge, both to try to save the empire in the aftermath of its collapse. And Europeans as well are going to have a great influence on this region going forward. And this is, the Qajar Empire, by the way, in a map. Notice it's located in modern Iran. So just like the Ottoman Empire, it too would collapse. So modernity, through the rise of Europe, it's going to have a dramatic effect on this region of the world. Okay, so that's it for my lecture today on modernization. Over the next few lectures, we're going to talk about the different ways that modernization is going to affect this region of the world during the 19th century. So I'll see you guys next time.